Okay, so we're going to move on to the Q&A session. I have a few questions myself, but we've already got one in the chat. And just as a reminder, either you can add it into the chat or just put up your hand. But I'm going to start with a question from Mohit Abral, which is for Celine, but I think Georgina and maybe even Connor, you might want to touch on this too. So Mohit says, thanks for this very engaging presentation, Celine. Waiting for Godot is an interesting illustration of what lies ahead. However, if the catastrophe is no longer imminent but has already begun, then would you characterize our current responses to Anthropocene as suffering from stasis? Does a lack of coordination and consensus at a policy and governmental level suggest that we are already in the endgame? Also, another question, could you speak a little bit more about how Beckett's plays offer creative ways to deal with the Anthropocene? So there's a couple of points to get into there, Celine.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think Georgina would have a lot to say about that as well from the prose perspective. So just feel free to jump in and add anything you'd like to add. And I know that I've discussed Beckett with Connor before, so Connor, just feel free to come in as well. Stasis, yeah, I was reading actually about how apparent stasis is really hiding change. And that's a big part of the theory of the Anthropocene. But I think another image that might be helpful with Beckett is that of juggling in the void, to answer the question of the Anthropocene. And there's that scene in Beckett where Vladimir and Estragon have got Lucky's hat and they are exchanging the hats and they are passing on the hats, and it looks like a juggling scene. So I think that would be another powerful image to think about what we are doing with the Anthropocene. And I think that more than stasis with the pandemic, we saw that kind of nostalgia that there is for the past and this idea of going back to normal, which is not really possible. So I think there are several dynamics which are at stake, and not only stasis, even though this is of course central to Beckett's plays and specifically to Waiting for Godot and Endgame. Then I think the second question, are we already at Endgame stage? Well, the interesting thing with Endgame is that the end of the play is also its start. So, you know, there is always a tomorrow. So I think we have to think about time in a broader perspective. And when I try to articulate the idea that we are in medias res at the start, it also makes us think about theater in a different way. It's not the action starting in the middle of a family problem. It's a bigger time frame that we are dealing with, and we are displacing time from the way we perceive time as the history of humanity to the history of Earth in general. So it's hard to say exactly if catastrophe has happened. Have we reached an endgame? Because within endgame itself, there's no end to the game. The game can start all over again. And it starts by the next performance. And so sorry for this non-answer. And the last question, creative ways to deal with the Anthropocene. Well, the next play that comes to mind to me is Happy Days, because I was presenting here on Beckett's early plays. And I think that Happy Days provides, first of all, a way to rethink what it means to be embedded in the earth and the notion of embeddedness itself. I know that it's core to Timothy Morton thinking of the Anthropocene and what is the position of the human. Are we separated from nature, if nature is a thing altogether, or are we part of this environment? And although Beckett is known for being quite strict about directing his plays and the way in which performances are happening, I think there is a lot more openness than what we think about. And so when we look at the performance of Happy Days, for example, there are so many examples of Winnie not being in the traditional mount. So I'm thinking here, for example, of Katie Mitchell's performance with water. I'm thinking about Stefan Braunschweig's performance in a sort of technological world. And I'm just fascinated about Sarah Jane Scaife new performance on Inishoor. Sorry to all Irish people if I mispronounced that. And Winnie is going to be embedded in the rock of the island. So I think this is one way of looking at creativity, by thinking local instead of thinking universal. And the other way in which I think it's productive to think about Beckett and dealing with the Anthropocene is by thinking about the way in which we don't know where we are going. There are high levels of contingency. And so there's a sort of hope with literature and with the arts that the more scenarios are created, the more ways we have to think about what we are and what can happen. And this is not from me. This has been theorized by Alan Bayan-Sarvitz and by Rosi Braidotti as well. And even Paul Crutzen was interviewed by a German journalist. And when he was asked, is there any hope for the future? He answered, yes, because we have literature. And in literature, we can find more scenarios, we can find more creativity to deal with the uncertainty of the Anthropocene. And Beckett is my personal prism to deal with all this and to deal with the contingency. But as Connor and Georgina showed, there are many other options out there for us. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Camilla. Celine, that was a very comprehensive and kind of hopeful answer, which was kind of nice. So Georgina, we're going to go to you. You might want to bounce off of Celine's work as well, but Andrea has a question. They say, I'm not familiar at all with Tokarczuk's works and the idea of a tender narrator, but I was wondering whether some proto-examples of it might be found in works such as The Waves by Virginia Woolf, who's come up a few times in this conference, and its fluid use of pronouns, or even in more recent works. Ali Smith is coming to mind. I might be completely off topic though. So, Georgina.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Andrea, for this question. I think absolutely. What's really interesting for me in chasing this topic is the fact that so many of the modernist writers in this kind of melding of fluid pronominal or relations between figures are touching on or dealing with the same, addressing the same issue, but it's read so often in terms of, modernist approaches to identity, or in the case of Beckett, post-structuralism and the dissolving of the I. It was really fascinating for me to read and to realize that, Beckett is addressing the same topic, and I think is the same in Woolf, very much so in The Waves. I'm not too familiar with Ali Smith. I've read some of her work, but not enough to say. But I don't get the impression, as I was trying to say, that it's not necessarily a concept that it's not like a villanelle that you have to try and write the perfect villanelle and then it's done and we don't have to worry about the tender narrator again. It's almost like it's a manifesto or a movement that she's proposing, and rather than one individual writer achieve it and actualize it and then we all get on better, carry on recycling. It's just, this is something that this is like arms for writers. A lot of the people that I've looked at, Hank Kang, Dasha Drindich, who I didn't get to speak about, but their use of the tender narrator looks back at addressing issues of the past. And one thing I did wonder about was how this might be realized in narrative if we have a forward-looking narrator that is looking forward and anticipating future atrocity. Because in Dasha's work, we really see somebody that is furiously redressing the wrongs of history. but to Karchuk's scope and the scope of the narrator has to, I mean, there's potential to look forward as well. I don't know if that's answered your question, but I hope so.
No, that was great. Connor, I don't know if you want to say anything more on the Tokarczuk thing.
The whole Tokarczuk thing. Yeah, I guess I'll weigh in. I thought I loved the talk, Trudina, and sorry for setting up a kind of high expectations, or you know, building the anticipation even more than you did with the opening long first slide. But I think you really brought it home perfectly. But one of the things that I really liked about your talk was just taking the approach that the tender narrator already exists. Because for me, one of the things that's in the lecture that's very striking is that there's a kind of messianism about it. So we do have all these kind of concrete descriptions of what that narrator might look like, but we also have this sentence about, you know, no doubt soon enough, some genius will come along who will completely reinvent and, you know, will write in a way that we could never imagine before, and we'll be kicking ourselves for not having thought about it. There's that very strong tendency in the Nobel lecture to look to some future literary savior. So even I think as a Germanist, she refers to Thomas Mann, she refers to the book Dr. Faustus, and how, you know, a certain type of music is described, but she says never, you know, like it's never really hinted at what this music would sound like, rather it's sort of an idea, like an idea of what would be possible that we'll never reach, which I think is kind of like, as a Germanist, it's not exactly right. Like the music is described quite in quite a lot of detail in the book, so it's like a willful misreading on Tokarczuk's part. And I think the talk was really astute to pay attention to this misdirection of pointing you to something in the future when actually maybe it's something that's already there. And I think Tokarczuk does this misdirection a lot. So I was thinking, Celine, with your little slide about reason, which I loved, that you had Cartesian kind of diagram, and you're like, no, I can't cover all this right now. I'm like, oh, please, no, redo the Enlightenment. But I think Tokarczuk's, one of her narrative tricks is often to take, as well as having the kind of some say, others say thing going on, this uncertainty, this play, she'll also have characters who are really sure of themselves, but through some discourse that we find a bit absurd. So Treivir Plow, the character is mad into astrology, and to her, like, everything makes sense through astrology. And I'm not sure how to bring those two things together, but I think she's just very good at pointing you in the wrong direction, or yeah, like she's exactly the kind of author who would say it's coming if it's already there. And I think that's interesting to think about in terms of different messianic traditions. So like Benjamin, who's another big name in German studies, has written about that before, like the famous line in Theses on Philosophy of History or whatever, where he says that, like, for the Jews, the Messiah never came, which means that every moment is the narrow door through which the Messiah might arrive. And there's, I don't know, I think the religious elements of all of these contemporary texts are interesting me more and more, and how you think about something being already a foregone conclusion versus the option of kind of a radical change or rescue. So yeah, that's what I would have to say about that.
Thanks, Connor. I feel like there's so many things that will come up at the moment because it's such an interesting topic that we're not going to get through to all of them. But Alicia's had her hand up for a while, so oh yeah, there. Can you unmute or?
Yes, sorry about that. Sorry, I saw there was a bit of traffic there. I think actually Kieran has a question, and I'd prefer him to go first. I kind of just have a question for the end.
Grand, perfect. I think, do we have time? I'll do Kieran's and then Alicia's, and then yeah, probably see how that goes. Okay, so Kieran, I don't know if you want to ask us yourself, or I can read it out. I don't know. Anyway, so so this is for Connor. So such an original, versatile presentation, Connor. Your wonderful quotes from Ursula Le Guin reminded me of Nuala Ní Dhomhnúil's Ceisne Teangain, a remarkable unbaggy poem, but sensitive to the human impulse to nurture and trust as analogous activities to speech and storytelling. More disturbingly, the shape-shifting image of the bag made me think of the hoods placed over prisoners' heads by ISIS and by American soldiers in Guantanamo Bay. That may be a cul-de-sac observation, but it could also be a way of discussing the suffocating aspects of both literary form and the challenges of the Anthropocene tangled up with power and empire. Yeah, this is actually really good. I'm glad this got up because I'm not gonna have time to ask this question, but connecting into what, the idea of Anthropocene with all of, and the problematic nature of it, I think is really interesting and relevant to all of your talks. So Connor, you can go first, but yeah.
Do you want to add any more? But I mean, you can maybe leapfrog the question on if you, or did you have a more detailed thing?
I know it was just something I was thinking about is like maybe necessarily like how important connected to this, there's this whole idea of disidentification or over-identification, and this search for kind of going beyond the human and, to look at whether we talk about, I love the bag analogy, with a bag or with, fourth person narrators or whatever it is, these tools, which obviously Jane Bennett and Timothy Morton and lots of eco-critics are really into. And I side with that to a point, but I think going back to this idea of the kind of tenderness and the aesthetics of care and that kind of idea, I would just wonder, and thinking a bit about Suwon Park's talk last night, is it maybe, are we jumping a step, and is it perhaps necessary, is there something wrong with anthropocentrism in the sense that should we not be, maybe is the problem not a lack of kind of empathy with humans and using that empathy to extend rather than needing to escape the cell, so to speak. Again, Kieran is, so yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for releasing me. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Kieran. And lovely to see you again. I think, as I would expect with a question from you, that's just it's taught me more than I can really say back. But I'll definitely make a note of Nuli Gonal, which I'm sure is a top class recommendation. And I think I think your point about the bag placed over the heads of prisoners, which links well to exactly Callum's question. No, I think that's not a cul-de-sac observation at all. I mean, it was weird to organize a presentation around bags, but it sort of helped me because I'm not very good at thinking in theoretical terms. So actually anything that's to do with bags that takes me off in what ends up being a theoretical direction that started with something simple is perfect for my kind of brain. But I think I'll definitely think about that a bit more and include that in this if it becomes part of the thesis research. I think it is a very important, a very important question whether we're skipping a step. I think maybe the way I was pitching the talk, sometimes there are a lot of things that have to go unsaid because you're looking at broadly what you've read and what things are addressed and what things aren't addressed. I think actually that is addressed quite a lot, or that's often, is quite a big element of the contemporary fiction that I'm looking at. So the real reason that Tokarczuk is so front and center for me is that most contemporary fiction, I cannot find a reason why it's fiction. I cannot find a reason why it wouldn't be better to read it as nonfiction, which I think is one of the things she points to in her Nobel lecture. And that includes, I mean, there are lots and lots of, that's part of the criticism of preachiness by Nicole Seymour, is just the fact that, this fact of constructing some unitary anthropos when really that's covering up extreme injustices, inequalities, that this is not, made by humans unilaterally, but that this is a capitalocene, that this is, made by, it's a legacy of imperialism, all those things. So I think I had to elide that in the talk, in that feels like the pizza base, or like what seems to be there everywhere when I look around. And Tokarczuk is she's some type of vegan topic. yeah, I mean, I'm really grateful for both those points, and I'll definitely include them.
Just say, Conor, that I absolutely loved your talk. I thought it was so
Okay.
effortlessly far-ranging and inspired the whole way through, and I loved it. And I'd like to apologize, actually. It was only when Callum was really out my kind of brain farts that I realized how kind of long
no, not at all.
were.
I find I'm right in the chat.
That's brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. I mean, I think Le Guin, I just, you know, sometimes if you read out a few quotes from these two, you can't go wrong. They're just so brilliant. But yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, are there Celine or Georgina, do you want to add anything to that, or will we go to Alicia's question? Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting what you said, Callum, about this idea of skipping a step. And I mean, it was something that perhaps I didn't expand on fully, but when I'm talking about this idea of disidentification with the I mean, I think you're completely right that it's not meant to imply some kind of, you know, existential, I don't know, absence of the self, but rather the decentralizing. So instead of seeing the individual self as central and of primary importance, to have this capacity to view and understand ourselves relationally with other humans, but also with our environment. And so that the disidentification there isn't necessarily this kind of, you know, existential, oh, who am I really? What is me? The way that Beckett has so often been rather this rebalancing, I think. And this is maybe a long-winded way of saying, yeah, I agree with you.
Great. So I'll just finish off, I think. Thank you so much for those two really interesting answers. Thank you, Kieran, for that. Yeah, very interesting. So Alicia, do you want to go, and maybe this will be the final question, just time-wise, unfortunately. I wish we could go to a pub or a cafe and talk about all of this, but anyway.
Figuring out how to lower my hand. Sorry, that's such a strange sentence. Okay, so I just wanted to ask about a common thread that I found, and again, a bit of a selfish question. It's very relevant to my own research that I'm finishing at the moment, but just I wanted to talk about, household items and interiors, and how Celine, I think your talk was really interesting about, I think what I took from it was even kind of some of Beckett's, you forget how some of his outdoor areas are even, have this very interiorized quality, the one bare tree, etc. And I think James Little has that quote about his closed spaces suggest an elsewhere, and that's obviously so interesting for ideas of kind of climate grief as a hyper object and stuff. And then also then Conor's talk, you were I found it really tied in with that, because it was talking about you know, plastic bags as this kind of exhausted thing, again another sort of household item, and then obviously I guess the interiority of bags, you know, and then and then also Georgina, you were talking about I'm actually currently reading Drive Your Plow, which is really in preparation for this. I just thought it sounded really interesting, but then you were talking about the means of kind of tender narration where household objects narrate the narrative themselves, and that's just all really cool. But basically I think I wanted to ask about whether this will kind of there'll be even more writing like this after the pandemic, because I just found it all really coincidental to the sort of research I was doing about households and household items, and you know, that being used to create some sort of universal, supposedly but you know, that's obviously very problematic, but you know, universal comment on the state of the world. And I was just so struck, you know, in quarantine and things, or during lockdowns, with how you kind of feel your room and the objects in it are these things you took with you from a former world or something, and things acquire this significance, or become portals to memory even more. But then what I also found is you know, I just don't know what literature will be like from, you know, the surge, I'm sure, that will arise from kind of various periods of you know, lockdown and the pandemic and such. And like I was wondering whether, like, what do you think about how some of those themes will be rendered then as sort of lockdown poetry? I've heard some friends who are poets refer kind of derisively a bit to lockdown poetry, and I think some people sort of think it shouldn't exist. And so basically I wanted to know what you think. I'm asking for a friend. I write lockdown poetry. But yeah, anyway.
Anyone want to jump in on that one?
That was a brilliant question.
So good.
Well, maybe just a question back. The two of us, we were part of the Beckett reading group, and we read his poetry for the whole year. And so did it speak to you in a way that as a poet yourself, you think is relevant to the current situation? Do you think, like, in a way that we are recycling old forms in the pandemic for something new, or do you think that there's a need for new form because the situation is new?
I think I'm really interested in the way that the pandemic, it's been such a, like, well, you could argue like the climate crisis and like billion other injustices are like this too, but maybe for a lot of people, maybe it's the first situation, like I feel like this, you know, where there's been just this very ongoing, unchanging kind of anxiety or something. And I wonder whether that like won't be able to render itself properly in literature, like, you know, a crisis that unhappening but that's sustained. Sorry, that's like not very good language. I mean, like something where it's simultaneously you feel very fearful but nothing's happening for a long time, or something, which I think is, you know, mirrored in environment stuff in some way, like, you know, where if you're living in an area that hasn't been, you know, like that obviously kind of struck by, say, natural disasters, and you kind of feel, you know, yeah, hyper object stuff, you know, it's happening but you're not able to see it or something. And yeah, I was wondering, like, will that be just difficult to render or something? But yeah, to answer your question, I loved reading the Beckett poems during lockdown. I love how almost like the references in his poems, like his early ones, there are these really incongruous kind of intertexts or references to other works, and they almost seem like the sort of the ramshackle collection of objects you have with you or something. And yeah, I just found that like so interesting as well.
Great. Oh yeah, Georgina, do you want to just have the last word there?
No, I don't want to have the last word, but I just wanted to, because Alicia was talking about intertextuality, and I feel like what's really interesting with these writers is how what Tokarczuk is calling for a reconfiguration of intertextuality. That for example, in early Beckett, intertextuality, okay, he's very much influenced by Joyce, but there's a performativity and maybe a, what's that word when you're like fancy, can't get pretension about it. Whereas for Tokarczuk, this intertextuality and this cross connectivity across books is creating a sense of solidarity of this universe of literature. And for me, that really struck home when reading Dasha Drindic's Belladonna, and she makes extensive references to Beckett's Not I. And I had initially thought that maybe Beckett wasn't suitable as a tender narrator because the context is so stripped. I mean, I know it's very much there, but that it was stripped back, that it didn't maybe have the capacity to acquire a granularity to create this universal, you know, scope. But then he's cropping up in a work that is so embedded with historical narratives. So it shows that yes, that Dash is able to approach a text like Not I, which is about this woman regaling this traumatized narrative, and a person who is listening to her gesturing empathetically, and place it front and center in her novel. So this again just makes me think that it's a reconfigure of intertextuality that is about finding elements of compassion in other narratives, or finding figures that we can empathize with, that we can create connections with across languages, across nations, genres, and I'll stop talking now.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so Nitra, very quickly. There is a question for Gigina from Young about bringing Korean writers. Maybe if you could, like, I don't know, answer it in like a very succinct way, because it is a really interesting question. So basically, more common than question, I was thinking how there is cultural difference with the narrators. In everyday life in Korea, the way we address each other is rarely by name, but by our relation to the person and using the collective. For instance, I would never refer to my mother by her name, but I call her our mother, as if that makes any sense. It does, and call people uncle and aunts, even though they are not our family. Just thought your tender narrate concept might also be a way of moving away from Western individualist discourse to other forms and perspectives. Super interesting question.
Thank you so much for this. Yes, absolutely. And I think that is why it's so important for me, even though, I mean, I know why it's so important for me not to approach this purely within the confines of English language writers, that this is very much about getting away from Westernist discourse and this type of oppressive binarisms and hierarchies that have, I don't know, that are contributing to and perpetuating this situation. Yeah, very much so. I'm going to screenshot what you've said so I can think about it more. Thank you so much.
Great. That could be, I think, a whole talk in of itself. It's a really interesting thing to look at. Okay, so I'm going to, unfortunately, because I'd love to be able to hear more of your thoughts, wrap up the session now, so you can get a quick break, run around, coffee, whatever, in the next 15 minutes. Thanks a mil to all of our speakers, also to Alicia and Tom for inviting me to chair this. I've really enjoyed it, really enjoyed the conversation that came out of your talks, and yeah, so I'll hand back over to the organizers. Thanks, guys.
No, thank you very much, Callum, and thank you to our speakers. That was absolutely wonderful. You can see we even ran a little bit over time because of the discussion, but we were fortunate. We had to cut, well, one speaker wasn't able to turn up, so there was a change of plan, and we still do have a 15-minute break after this. So there is a bit of time to, as Callum says, have a run around, grab a coffee, or whatever you need. And we'll see each other again at 11 o'clock, so in 15 minutes for what looks like an amazing panel on that very tricky boundary of a border, citizenship, migration, and refugee studies. So looking forward to seeing you all, and see you in 15.
Goodbye. Thank you all so much.